go in my name, and because you've forgiven, others will also experience forgiveness. Peter was there last week when we were talking about the call, the invitation to come and follow me that was given by Jesus. And Peter was rather an ordinary bloke, and he was blown away. There was a catch, not a catch in the call, but a catch of fish before them that left him rather startled, amazed, blown away. And in Luke's Gospel it becomes a promise. Because Luke is writing to us, he's writing to the early church, he's writing to a significant leader who has come to know Christ and become a lover of God. And so what we see and what we read or what we hear is actually being addressed to such as us. Not to Peter so much, but to us. But we do see in this amazing catch the potential, the possibility that what's beginning here will produce a huge harvest. That the church will not be, when it forms, something that's insignificant, but will have an impact at a global scale. It will transform people and societies and nations and cultures. But Peter is a bit like many of us, I guess, as he stands there and he says, "Oh, goodness me, I can't be part of this. You go away from me, Lord. I'm just an ordinary and I'm a sinful bloke. I can't be part of your team because I'm not good enough." But not good enough for what? Well, if we go back a couple of weeks, we encountered the manifesto of Jesus. And the manifesto of Jesus was something that said, because the Spirit is on me, or I know the Spirit is on me because the way I see the world. Those who the world excludes, rebukes, chucks out, discards, rejects, are included in my mission. Wow. So I'm sorry, Peter, there's no opting out. You haven't got a valid excuse whatsoever. Because the mission of Jesus is inclusive of blokes like you. We're welcome. Somebody honoured me this morning with a greeting, and all I can say is I'm just a kid from the bush. Why me? I have no idea, but as I've said before, you've just got to get on with it and accept that he does call you and he does use you. And Peter is having to deal with it, and I think we're all having to deal with it constantly. That we are being called, and the manifesto said, my mission is inclusive. And those who don't feel good enough are going to be included. And remarkably, there'll be a whole lot of healing goes on in the process for Peter as he makes a journey to being called, as he is here, an apostle. Wow. But let's leave that manifesto alone for a moment and just sort of say, well, that's going to rest there. We've got no excuses. We're all being called. That invitation remains, and the forgiveness that Jesus offers to Matthew, to Peter, includes all these other guys as well. So we're included. So, okay. So what do? And Jesus starts teaching. And he begins by saying to them that I want to release people from the trap of cycles of violence. Because I'm wanting you to understand that I want you to be able to love according to my manifesto. I want you to be able to love, well, even my enemy. We're not to remain trapped in cycles of retribution. They don't like me, so I don't like them. He hurts me, so I hurt him. She's vicious, so I'll be vicious. Wait on. We're not going to be trapped in that retributive cycle, but in terms of something that's a bit different, more something like retributive justice. And when you think about that, when you're released from this, you sort of encounter something that becomes dynamic. It requires proactive action. It's not something that creeps up on you. It's something that confronts you, and you have to make choices. So what we're encountering as Jesus begins to say to these guys, to us, the way we're going to work in this broken, wounded world is going to be something that is chosen, a proactive way. It will be a set of dynamic behaviours. It will surprise yourself, and the outcomes will be transformative. During a war in Solomon Islands, perhaps the student that had been with us in Sydney for training, perhaps the one who felt most inadequate. He'd only had 4 years of primary education. He didn't know how to deal with all this violence and all this gun trading and running and arming that went on and digging of bunkers and chasing enemies around the bush. But he knew it was wrong. And he went back and immediately decided, well, I must go to my own people. And I'm going to open up something for them to think about. I can't yet go to the enemy, but at least I can begin to start with my own people. So though he lived in the capital, in Honiara, he decided to go back to his own village at Ura on the west coast of Malaya. And the problem was I was the principal of the college, and no matter how many other faculty had taught him and trained him, when he got back there, I was the one that had to go and join him. That's rather scary in the middle of a war, I assure you. But you're going with the locals, and you know the locals will protect you with their lives, and so you humble yourself and you go. And I remember one morning, the very first morning, the church in Ura was packed with delegates that they invited from other communities around about there. And they began teaching something very simple. And they started talking about all the mess that they were in. And they began to summarise it, as I did a moment ago. They summarised it as a cycle of violence. And they were talking took place in their own language, Kwarai. But when they talk and teach in Kwarai, they keep putting pidgin into it. Though I know Kwarai, I can pick up bits of pidgin. Every now and again they'll come to a technical word, and that word will be in English. So I'm listening and I taught them and to some extent, so I sort of have an idea where they're going. And with the bits of English and the bits of pidgin, I was able to follow where they were headed. And so as he talked, I could see him mapping it, and I went to the board and put it on the board, a circle that started, "You hurt me." Why you? H-U-T, me, M-I. You hit me, and an arrow to me hit you, and you hit me, and me hit you, and you hit me hit you. And it was going round and round and round. And then he said with his hands, "How on earth do we get out of this cycle?" And he threw his arm out and he said, "We open the door, and the door is forgiveness." Forgiveness in the middle of a war? And you wonder whether this manifesto and then this teaching of Jesus actually works. And as they did that, and before they went to morning tea, they began to respond to this need to give forgiveness to others and to experience forgiveness. And they didn't rush out and get on a boat and go and find their enemies on some other part of the country. They just turned around and saw somebody sitting near them or beside them. And I remember one guy going to a guy just near where I was sitting, and he said, "When you were nominated to be our pastor, I voted against you. Can you forgive me?" And the forgiveness began in that little moment. And the 83 people that were there that morning were all engaged in seeking forgiveness from one another. It just went on and on and on. They found others to, and once it started, they all began to. And I can tell you, not only did those 83 people, it was, not only those 83 people changed, but the whole of that village and that community changed. And they'd been doing it tough. And the resolutions that they made were they could take this further. And when I left on the boat from Auki to go back to Honiara and was seen off, he said, "Thank you for being with us. You go back, my wife, look after you. And I'm going to the north, up to the north end of my big island. I'm going to do this again in another community." And he did. And so the first place he went was to load up a truck with several bags of half a ton of rice, so whoever came, he could feed them on rice and a cup of tea each day of the week. And so it happened again. You see, Jesus chose a dozen disciples, and I'm just describing one. And as we become engaged and active in the mission team, things change. Societies change. Relationships change. And people begin right where they are, as difficult as life may be at that moment, to begin to find hope again. To begin, maybe, in me, there could be some peace as I offer forgiveness and receive forgiveness. It may not mean that we all get together. We may continue to live on different islands and different cultures, but we won't be hunting one another. We won't be pursuing each other. We will learn together to put together our relationships and our communities in a beautiful way. And as you follow this teaching of Jesus as he taught his disciples, he was teaching them to press green buttons when they wanted to press red buttons. A Roman soldier meets you in the street and he challenges you and he puts you down with a slap across the face. Jesus said, "Turn the other cheek." That means the soldier's got to put down his sword, because he can't hit you with the other cheek until he puts his sword down. It's quite uncanny, isn't it? And when they take something from you, don't curse them. Pray for them. And so you begin to see a pattern emerging in all of that teaching that Jesus said, there's my manifesto, you are the people I'm calling, and this is how we're going to begin to do it. But we can make a difference in this world if we've got that view of the world and of people, and we've got this behaviour and these hearts within us. There are many times when hate arises and you want to deal with that and challenge others and so on. But sometimes you just got to say, okay, I'm going to let that go. I need to come away from this situation and I need to find some healing within me first. But in that process, I can realise that I need to heal. This whole pattern of non-violence, of response to a smack on the face, is seen in the bigger picture when you look at where we've been this morning. That Jesus on the cross actually prayed for his enemies, for his persecutors, for those who were abusing him, those who treated him unjustly and violently. But if that's not enough and you begin to understand that this is God in Christ, you begin to see this non-violence of God. I know there was in old, and probably still around in some theologies, that God killed his son and the son was brutalised with the will of the Father. But when you come and discover Paul and Peter and Luke teaching you, you realise that this was God in Christ. And so we come to the Christian creed that Jesus is Lord. Not just my boss, not one that calls me, but he is God. And so God comes in Christ and is the victim on the cross. Not the brutal one. And Paul had to get that straight in his mind too, because Paul was the one who was a brutal man who wanted to punish and destroy and make captive and bring them and have them abused and stoned to death, and all his zealousness. Yet he was confronted too on the road as he approached Damascus and all that was brewing in front of him, and he was stewing and cooking over these things, and finally it broke through. And here comes the Trinitarian revelation to Paul as he said, okay, God, who are you? And you know the answer. The answer was the same answer that Moses got. God spoke two words, if you like, in English, I am. And God, speaking to this zealous Jewish man who stood in the tradition of Moses, knew who was speaking to him. And at that moment of all, he was absolutely overwhelmed. But the stunning bit that followed was the next word, when he said, I am Yesu, I am Jesus. I am and Jesus are being co-identified. And coming back towards our text this morning, there's one further revelation that comes in that next moment, when this violent man, Paul, the persecutor of the early church, the beginning, the embryonic church, Here's the next word. I am, Yesu, the people of the Spirit, the people you are persecuting. These people, drawn and overwhelmed and infilled by the Spirit, drawn into this little community, are suddenly, oh my, when I'm persecuting them, I'm persecuting God. I am, Jesus, the people you were persecuting. And Paul is transformed. And it took him a long time of reflection and rereading all his scriptures, because there he says there was one stumbling block that had to be demolished at the end, because I knew that in Deuteronomy it said anyone who dies on a tree is cursed by God. So this Jesus who died on the tree could not be God because he was cursed by God. That's the way Paul read his scriptures. But now it had all changed, because the one that was on the tree was God himself, taking all the curses upon himself. And we are liberated, and we are set free. So Jesus, in beginning journeys with us, calls us to be agents that are committed to the practice of non-violence, that are committed to loving those we struggle with, to be able to engage with green buttons when we want to press red buttons, and we engage this part of our head because we're not robots. We can choose a green button instead of a red button. And so, as children of the Most High, as disciples called by Jesus, we begin to see now what that huge catch of fish is all about. It's the promise that this practice of ministry and mission will change the world, and you will be stunned at the harvest. But let me add a couple of little footnotes in here in case you think I've gone nuts. Forgiveness does not does not accept impunity. Impunity is where the offenders can just keep going and doing whatever they want to do with never being brought to account. They have to be brought to account. For where impunity has kicked in, as in many places around the world, in the Balkans, Latin America, gone on for centuries and centuries, generation after generation, in the violence and the destruction was never brought to account. And it breeds bitterness and resentment deep. And so forgiveness is a generous thing, but the community together takes account of criminality. And even Jesus' manifesto for those who are abused and for those who've been abusers, for those who are justifiably in prisons and so on, are given an offer not only of forgiveness but of restoration. But when we restore people back into our community, we call that restorative justice. So forgiveness is a powerful agent that opens the door to transform the world and society. And so I want you to understand that the manifesto of Jesus and the gift of Christ to us is not just a personal salvation. It's a personal salvation for all of us. And collectively, we are called to be in the discipleship team. And there's this remarkable truth that Luke puts together through the two of his books of his writing. He comes to say to you in the end that you are called by God to be evidence of his kind of love, of his grace, breaking, bursting, transforming the world. Forgiveness is freely given, and therefore we're called to give it freely. Let's sing together.